Hi, everyone. Welcome. We'll get started in just a minute here. Thanks. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome. My name is John Hausknecht. I'm a professor of human resources here at the Cornell Industrial and Labor Relations, or ILR School. And I'm speaking to you today on behalf of our Center for Advanced HR Studies, or CAHRS for short, in continuation of our series on AI and talent management, practical applications and future directions. So today's topic is focused around talent analytics and workforce planning, and I'll be leading today's session and glad to be here with you today. So if you'd like to participate into today's discussion, there are two ways you can do that. One is by submitting questions through the Q&A feature, and I'll take a look at that and see if I can answer any questions that come through. And also feel free to chat with one another and share reactions through the chat feature. So with that, we'll go ahead and kick things off by kind of overviewing the topic and summarizing some of the things that we're seeing, both in terms of talking with companies, in terms of research, and as well as things that we're hearing and seeing in the classroom with our students. So just by way of overview, I want to talk about three key areas where I think AI is starting to show its ability to support talent analytics and workforce planning in particular. And so I'll walk through each of these, but Gen AI for employee listening, AI for workforce planning, and then the notion of AI-generated reporting and insights. So let's start with the first around Gen AI for employee listening. And as many of you are familiar, companies have been surveying and polling employees for decades. And what started as kind of a more cumbersome process with paper surveys evolved into online surveys. And we're seeing a point now where there's just lots of opportunity to interact with employees on a more regular basis. And that's both with structured surveys, but also with unstructured formats where we're asking employees for their input more in text or unstructured formats. And so one of the applications within analytics, rather than kind of manually coding and thinking through the key themes of some of that sentiment, AI tools can now analyze large volumes of text data, summarize key themes, and provide more sort of understandable, high-level reports about what employee sentiment is on a given topic. And so that's just sort of, the surface of this in terms of what's happening with employee listening. I was just doing a little bit of work to see what some of the companies are up to these days on using AI for employee listening. And it's not just surveys, but it's also collaboration tools like Teams and Slack. It's also some of the other apps that companies might use for work management or for navigating projects, and where there might be employee insights to glean or to gain as you look across those collaboration tools. So the kind of key insight for me is that, one, it's not just your traditional survey where we're pulling the data, which is more of an active approach, but these tools are starting to pull information from passive data sources or pull information passively from other data sources, like the collaboration tools or other apps, and then consolidating all of that information to provide more of a real-time snapshot of what employees are thinking or what their concerns are. So I think that's maybe the insight here on this first bucket, is just thinking about how these tools can pull from multiple data sources and consolidate information in a way that's a little bit more real-time. Employee surveys historically have been sort of a long rollout, and then you have to wait for the reporting. And by the time the results are in, sometimes the insights are a little bit stale. And so some of these tools seem to be trying to leverage real-time information so that you can act more quickly. So I found that to be kind of an interesting development in the employee listening space, which we know, of course, is kind of a heavy data component historically, and something that talent analytics groups spend a good amount of time on. So the second major bucket around workforce planning is also pretty interesting. When you look historically, workforce planning is one of those areas that I feel like a lot of companies have struggled to get right or to feel like they're getting right. And so, looking at some of the tools here, when you think about the kind of crux of workforce planning as being about matching talent demand and talent supply, historically, the tools have been somewhat coarse for trying to get a sense of who you have and what roles with what skills, and then trying to understand kind of, how you match that in a more dynamic way over time, right? And so workforce planning has multiple flavors, I guess you could say, in the sense that we might think pretty high level, kind of matching our future demand in the coming years to talent pools that we need to build or start thinking about, to maybe something a little bit more operational, where we're looking ahead a year or 6 months and trying to forecast demand and then talent supply. But then also the really granular kind of scheduling component of workforce planning is another area where we're seeing some developments within the AI space. So I'll talk about just a couple of examples here. When we think about the more granular approaches, for example, you're routing maybe salespeople through a territory and they're doing service or sales calls with customers. Kind of a classic problem, right? And there's lots of inputs into this. You have both on the worker side, when are they available? How long does maybe a visit take? What's the complexity of the visit? What's some operational factors like what's the weather like? What's traffic like? What's the optimal way to route people to different locations given the task and given their skills and so forth, right? So it becomes a pretty complex problem for companies that have a heavy operational element to their business. And so what you're seeing with some of these AI-based tools, much like Gen AI for employee listening, is that they're pulling from multiple data sources to try to optimize who is routed where, or assigned where for a given day or shift or assignment. And the interesting part to me is that it's trying to pull internal and external data, right? Who do you have, again, in real time, accounting for maybe turnover or employees who are out in a given period, but then also factors like the weather or factors like maybe real-time traffic data to try to optimize your scheduling and planning of people in locations. So again, kind of an interesting take on a classic problem that AI might have the capacity to pull the information together, analyze it, and make recommendations in ways that humans have been unable to up to this point. So the third one is around AI-generated insights and storytelling. And this is another interesting development, especially for those who work in the talent analytics space, or even for those who kind of consume talent data on a regular basis. And the idea here is that, again, historically, we've pulled in data from multiple sources and housed it in various systems. And then, of course, query those systems, create custom reports or standard reports, maybe build some dashboards or other interfaces for people to interact with the data. But the challenge is oftentimes kind of, what information should I pay attention to? How do I make sense of this in context? And then what does it mean? What do I do with it, right? And so some of the tools with an AI focus in this space are trying to use AI technology to think about putting the story together for you. And so a couple of examples. One is, just looking at historical data. Let's say it's attrition data for the last several months. Thinking about not only the data, but maybe how you compare to other units, how you compare to external benchmarks. Again, this idea of blending internal and external data comes up with this third bucket. Is the idea of this kind of third innovation is just augmenting some story and some context to traditional reporting, traditional reports and outputs that we might otherwise get. The other piece that I think is interesting here is that it's not just the data itself, but kind of making it easier to build the story by asking questions. So think of like a chat bot where you could say, if you're a business leader, what is the demographic representation amongst my leadership team? You get immediate answers based on real-time information as opposed to looking it up or kind of going to multiple systems to try to pull this together. But then maybe you also have other questions like, what have been the historical promotion rates at our company over the last 5 years? Being able to ask some of those questions in a way where you get the immediate information to help you kind of build a case for a change or for an intervention is another innovation in this area where it's building on that raw data, but in ways that are kind of unique and more real time, and providing this sort of collective intelligence based on internal historical data or just internal information, right? So we've seen some companies that are building internal chatbots where you can ask questions about your own internal company information and limiting it to that rather than kind of your general chat GPT, which is essentially tapping the internet. So that's another area of development here where I think analytics, people who work with data are seeing some opportunities to maybe augment what they're already doing through some of these tools that would support some of the insights and recommendations. The second major question that we've been addressing in these in this webcast series is, what can analytics and workforce planning teams do to support the AI revolution? So kind of flipping the question that we had in the previous slide. And I see sort of three main opportunities here. One is, I think talent analytics teams in particular are uniquely positioned to advise HR, IT, senior leaders about the possibilities and potential for AI. Analytics teams have to sort of already interface across different domains, working with IT folks, kind of bridging the gap between business leaders, HR, et cetera, and providing insights that cut across multiple areas. So, just having that position, I think, puts folks who work in talent analytics in a unique role to be able to advise pros and cons of using AI-based tools for certain questions or for certain, purposes in ways that maybe others wouldn't see so cleanly because they're not as close to the existing data or use cases that have taken place in the past. So to me, that's a really important one. Second one is somewhat related, and that's that both talent analytics and workforce planning teams have a unique perspective in that they see across multiple data sources on a regular basis. So if you think about workforce planning, for example, you are tasked with a very complex problem of forecasting, talking to business leaders to forecast future business demand, thinking about the talent needs based on that, then working backwards to figure out what your supply is for the upcoming period while accounting for promotions, exits, all sorts of movements into up and out of the organization, right? So that requires tapping into a variety of databases, talking to multiple stakeholders, and thinking about the architecture you might need to build to be able to ask questions of maybe an AI-based chatbot around workforce planning. And so, again, I think talent analytics teams and workforce planning people who work in workforce planning have this unique insight to see across data sources and maybe see the potential to link in ways that we haven't in the past. The third is just in terms of responsible implementation. There's a lot of interest and buzz in AI for various HR activities and areas. And again, talent analytics folks and workforce planning individuals can really think about how do we use this information in a way that's valid, number one, it's useful, it's ethical, it's appropriate, right? We wouldn't want to see these AI-based tools kind of learning incorrect patterns or suggesting movements of employees that aren't appropriate, right? And so even though workforce planning is thorny and maybe AI tools can help reduce some of the complexity, we have to be kind of really careful about taking steps to make sure that we're getting what we need and that the outputs are just as credible as if they were human-based. So I think that's one of the other considerations that these teams will have to kind of consider going forward. So just kind of moving ahead here to some future directions, and then I have a couple thoughts or kind of questions to leave you with, but then feel free to ask your own questions, and we'll turn to that towards the end here. So in terms of some possibilities for the future, what to keep an eye on, I've got three main themes here. And the first is around what we're seeing around industry maturity and consolidation. The highlight screen grab here is from Workday investing in AI with an acquisition, but they're one of many companies that are trying to consolidate and bring together some of the different technologies. So a number of the examples that I've given to you today are not all coming from one company, right? There are multiple companies who are kind of taking a unique perspective on the role of HI and how it might, the role of AI and how it might help in HR for various activities. And so that, I think, is leading to sort of a lot of fragmentation. Just looking across, dozens and dozens of companies that have the technology to do some piece of the broader analytics or workforce planning or other areas too of HR. But what's happening, it seems to me, is that we're going to enter a period of consolidation where you kind of have some fuller range, have a fuller range of offerings for some of the AI-based tools that currently are sort of fragmented today. A second main bucket is around the legal and ethical considerations, what I alluded to on the previous slide. I've highlighted here New York City's AI-based hiring law. And it's one example of some early efforts from a legislation standpoint to kind of regulate how companies are using AI, especially in the hiring process. But it's pretty clear that it's not just a legal consideration, but an ethical consideration. And so we're seeing, especially some of the large companies like IBM and others, developing and maintaining ethics boards, right, to cut across different applications, potential applications of AI in the workplace, and think about whether it's right given their culture and given the current legal environment, given their workforce and their goals. So I think that's something too that's developing alongside the AI tools and technology is how do we govern this effectively, and how do we think about what's ethical and right given the state of both the technology and our employees' readiness for it. The third area to keep an eye on is just some of the research developments in this space. We have to remember that analytics itself is not very old in HR. Some of the earliest writings in Harvard Business Review are right around 2010 for talking about talent analytics. And so here we are, not even 15 years later, looking at AI, and I don't even think we figured out yet some of the tools, right tools and approaches for basic data and analytics, much less the role of AI and kind of what that means. So a lot of work is starting to be done to think about what would this look like? What are the implications, given that these decisions impact a large segment of society and for sure, core set of workers and their jobs going forward. So the research front is something too that I know I'll be following as we go forward. Last slide then, and we'll open it up for any questions from the group, is just to me, what are some open questions in this space as we think about AI for talent analytics and workforce planning? And the first is a question of whether the potential can be realized. So many of the examples that I've given you in the opening slides are sort of, promising directions that companies are proposing that they can take with, a company's data and so forth with using AI tools. The question here is, I think, will we get there, especially when it comes to workforce planning? I have a screenshot here of a paper called Models and Modeling for Manpower Planning. That title alone may give away the dated nature of this article. It was published in 1966. And so here we are in 2024, asking some of the same questions. How do we come up with models that solve the workforce planning challenges and workforce forecasting issues that companies face, whether that's the granular or kind of near term or longer term? Will the tools that we have and those that are coming up actually help us solve some of the core challenges involved with workforce planning? And so I think that's one of the open questions here. A second is around just what will employees accept? And we see this with our students. This report here talks about what millennials think about AI, suggesting about half believe that it'll be essential to their role. About half are excited, more excited than fearful. And I think that's reflective of sort of some of the sentiment right now, right? Maybe some cautiousness, some optimism, depending on the use case. But that's something that's ahead as well for this area is what will employees allow? Where will the lines be drawn? What's ethical? What's too much? And we're starting to see some of that already with the legislation. And I do think companies are also grappling with, what are appropriate use cases for some of the AI-based tools? And then where do we want to maybe wait a little bit and see if we have the buy-in and support? And then the last point is just around the analytics roles themselves and how will they change. And so I just did a bit of searching here for what companies are looking for as they staff up their HR analytics teams. And you are seeing more of a need or a desire for people working in these roles who have an understanding and appreciation for some of the more advanced modeling techniques, machine learning, large language models, can kind of sit at the interface again, like I talked about earlier, of helping navigate this complexity as companies think about what the role of AI will be in managing the workforce. So those are some top thoughts I had as far as what the developments are, what some of the key questions and issues are. And I'll go ahead and turn to questions here, see if we have any from the audience. You can use the chat. Looks like one has come in already from someone who asks, how are AI tools pulling from Teams and Slack? Is that behind the scenes capture of individual chats? So the tools that I investigated in preparing for this do seem to have a connection interface with either Teams or Slack or other apps so that they can pull from or monitor slash synthesize some of the chat or even just, who's collaborating with whom based on names and, employee databases. But I don't know the technical interface there of how they're doing it. The other piece I saw more clearly was for something like a Qualtrics or a Glint survey. There were repositories where you literally upload your data file, and the app includes that along with the Teams, the Slack, and the others to sort of synthesize. And there's a dashboard that cuts across and tries to summarize the sentiment, and it will tell you where it found that. Was it from the survey? Was it from this data source or that data source? So there's some mechanism behind the scenes that's connecting to some of those tools. Another question that came in: how are companies dealing with constantly changing laws in various countries and legal's wariness around this? It's a really good question, and I think the legal front is something that remains to be seen. The New York City law, for instance, I know had a lot of questions around it initially as it was being drafted. There were lots of delays to get the wording right because it was too broad, too vague, according to many who provided input. So they revised it down, and then some feel now it's too narrow and it doesn't apply to too many companies or too many scenarios. And so that one, I think, is a lot of waiting to see precedent and what's likely to happen on that front. My sense, too, is that companies are trying to get ahead of it a bit with the ethics boards and with their own transparency and kind of governance of some of the tools, and then maybe help advise, government and other legislators to think carefully about how, where they need guidance, where they want guidance. Employees obviously have a say too in terms of what they want, and but it is evolving. I think, to me, it seems like companies, just based on the ones I've interacted with, are taking it on internally and not waiting for governments to come up with the legislation. And part of that is, to me, again, because it's complicated to even propose what this would look like and what you can and can't require or have audited or have kind of legislated. So, but it's an ongoing issue, something we're in the midst of for sure. Another question: do you know the % of the workforce that will be needed to fill these roles? If that's in relation to the questions around, I see here. HR analytics. Okay, thank you. So in terms of HR analytics roles, they are increasing, to me, in terms of more companies have a people analytics team, or at least someone who does people analytics. And I know of several larger companies that have grown their teams significantly over time. But it's not large, right? Even the biggest teams that I can think of, in the 20s or maybe 30s at most, that's not that large relative to the size of the organization that they're serving. And then, like I said, some companies have just one or two people who are doing workforce analytics. So I don't know that AI is driving that. I think it's just a proliferation of data and more pull from the business to say we want to make more of the data that we have. That's driving a greater interest in workforce analytics roles. But that's a good question. Any other questions from the group here? Okay, so I'll then just kind of wrap up for today with a summary of where the AI and talent management series is. Again, it's meant to be kind of a quick update from several of the faculty on different topic areas and what AI, what role AI is playing. So you may have heard from my colleague J.R. Keller for the first one on employee attraction and mobility. Today's session you see here, and then two remaining sessions on the employee experience, a little bit deeper dive on that topic that I mentioned, as well as performance management on June 5th. So you can find more information about those webinars and everything else about CAHRS and the ILR school at this link. But I do thank you for attending today. Hope you found some of this useful and have a good rest of the afternoon. Thanks.